never believed in the supernatural, nor did I ever consider myself paranoid. I always thought of myself as rational, someone who could explain away strange noises in the night or flickering lights as simple electrical issues. That is, until I moved into that house. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just a cheap rental while I saved up for something better. It was a small, outdated place on the outskirts of town, where the streetlights barely reached and the neighbors were scarce. The kind of place that had seen better days, with chipped paint and a slightly musty scent clinging to the walls. The first few nights were normal, aside from the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. But then, I started noticing little things. At first, it was subtle. A door I swore I closed would be ajar. The cabinet doors in the kitchen sometimes seemed to open by themselves. I chalked it up to forgetfulness, maybe even a draft. But then, things escalated. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floor just outside my bedroom door. My breath hitched. I lived alone. I sat up, heart pounding, straining my ears. The sound had stopped. I waited, gripping the edge of my blanket like a child hiding from the monster under the bed. Then, the footsteps started again, closer this time, right outside my door. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. I reached for the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and slowly got up. I crept toward the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. With a shaky hand, I turned the knob and swung the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. But something felt off. A chill ran through me, making my skin prickle. I forced a laugh, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew better. The next night was worse. I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep, determined to avoid another night of paranoia. But around 3 in the morning, I woke up with a start. My room felt different, colder. And then, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but breathing. Soft, raspy breathing, right outside my door. My entire body went rigid. The sound was so close, just on the other side of the thin wooden door. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. Just as I did, the breathing stopped. Complete silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following day, I decided to set up my phone to record while I slept. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going insane. Before bed, I placed it on my dresser, camera facing the door. I made sure to lock my room again, double-checking it this time. That night, I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. But I didn't hear anything. No breathing, no footsteps, just stillness. The next morning, I hesitated before checking the footage. Part of me didn't want to know, but I had to. I opened the video and skimmed through the first few hours. Nothing. Just me shifting in bed a few times. And then, at around 3:14 a.m., my bedroom door locked. Mind you slowly creaked open. I paused the video, my heart hammering in my chest. That was impossible. I had locked that door. Then, I saw it. A dark figure, barely distinguishable against the shadows, stepped into the room. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, watching me sleep. And then, the worst part, it moved. Not toward me, but toward the camera. As if it knew. As if it saw what I was trying to do. The video ended abruptly, cutting to static. I dropped my phone, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to run, to leave that house, and never look back. But I was frozen. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not from the phone. From right behind me. I never turned around. I bolted, grabbing my keys and running out of that house, leaving everything behind. I didn't care. I drove straight to a friend's place and didn't go back for days. When I finally did, it was with a group of people in broad daylight. The house was empty. No signs of forced entry. No explanation for what had happened. But I didn't need one. I knew what I saw. What I heard. I moved out that same day. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that figure. Still hear the whisper. And I wonder if it ever really left. I always thought being home alone would be fun. No parents, no rules, just me, the house, and complete freedom. But I never imagined how quickly that freedom could turn into something terrifying. It started as a normal evening. My parents had gone out for the night, leaving me with a pizza, a couple of movies, and the promise that they'd be back before midnight. I had no problem being alone, I'd done it before. But something about that night felt off. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I'd watched too many horror movies, or maybe it was just the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. The air in the house felt heavier, like something unseen was watching me. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle of leaves outside the window made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself with the movie, but I found myself glancing at the dark hallway every few minutes, my ears straining for any unusual sound. Then the power flickered. Just for a second. The screen went black, the lights dimmed, and my heart stopped. But just as quickly, everything came back to normal. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. I reached for my phone to text my mom, just for reassurance, but the Wi-Fi was out. No connection. That was weird. I still had service, so I shrugged it off, but something about that sent a chill down my spine. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. I froze. The house was old, it made noises. That's what I told myself. But this was different. It wasn't random. It was the sound of footsteps. I muted the TV and held my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Was someone in the house? I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and stood up slowly, my knees trembling. I told myself to be rational. Maybe I'd left a window open and the wind was moving something. Maybe it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took slow, cautious steps toward the staircase. The hallway light flickered again, making my stomach twist with unease. I forced myself to look up the stairs. The darkness at the top felt suffocating, swallowing everything beyond the last step. Then, I heard it, a whisper, a low, raspy voice calling my name. I dropped the knife. My body locked up, frozen in fear. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to back away. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Another whisper, closer this time. Then, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. I turned and bolted. My only thought was to get out. I reached the front door and yanked at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. A creak behind me. Slow footsteps descending the stairs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I yanked the door open and ran outside, barefoot and blind with fear. The night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. Only then did I dare to turn around. The house stood silent. The door was wide open, the darkness inside yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the doorway, watching me. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they answered. I was a mess, sobbing, shaking. The police were called, and when they arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of anyone being inside. But I know what I saw. My parents never left me home alone again after that night. And even now, years later, I still wonder if I hadn't run. If I had turned around sooner, would I have seen something standing behind me? And worse, would it have followed me? I'll never forget that night, the night that changed everything. It was like any other night, or so I thought. I had just moved into this old house on the outskirts of town, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the chaos of the city. The house was big, maybe too big for just me, but I liked the idea of having space. The kind of space where no one could bother me. No neighbors knocking on my door, no noise, just silence. But there's something about silence that's deceptive. It makes you think you're alone, that you're safe, when in reality, it can be a breeding ground for things that can't be explained. It started out small, just little things I could dismiss: creaky floorboards in the hallway, faint tapping sounds that echoed from the walls. I told myself it was nothing, just an old house settling. It was a comforting thought, one I could hold on to. I went on with my nights, binge-watching shows, getting lost in books, trying to settle into this new life. But I noticed it more on the nights I was alone. One night, as I was sitting on the couch, reading, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps above me. Soft at first, like someone was walking across the floor of the attic. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. My heart raced. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal that had gotten into the attic somehow. But the sound persisted, louder this time. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. I couldn't convince myself that it was anything else. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the stairs. The attic door was at the top, a small wooden door with a rusted handle. I reached out, my hand hovering just above it. The house was silent now, not a single creak or groan to be heard. I opened the door, the hinges squealing as they protested, and peered inside. It was empty. No one was there. I stepped inside cautiously, the musty smell of dust filling the air. There were old boxes, stacked high, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. I turned on the light, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. I laughed to myself, feeling ridiculous. Of course, there was no one there. I must have just imagined it. I was probably just tired. But the moment I turned to leave, the sound came again. This time, right behind me. A soft tap on the wooden floor. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. My breath hitched in my chest. I quickly backed away, hurrying down the stairs. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I wanted to ignore it, to push it out of my mind. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me. I kept hearing those footsteps, echoing in my mind, growing louder, closer. The next day, I was determined to push the thought from my mind. I had a lot of work to catch up on, and I needed to stay focused. But that night, the footsteps came back. This time, they weren't just from the attic. They were from downstairs. I heard them clearly as I sat in the living room, the soft thud of boots on wood. Step by step, they moved closer. I felt my pulse quicken as I stood frozen in place. My eyes scanned the room. No one was there. The front door was locked, and the windows were shut tight. I was alone. But the footsteps continued, just out of view. They moved across the floor in a steady rhythm, like they knew exactly where they were going. I couldn't breathe. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as I walked toward the noise, my hand trembling as I reached for the hallway light. Nothing. There was no one there, but the noise continued, growing louder, closer, as though whatever it was coming toward me. I turned to run, my heart slamming in my chest, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. The house was playing games with me. I tried to open the door, pulling on the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. My breath was ragged as panic set in. I turned around, the silence now deafening, and there it was, a shadow. I could see it, barely, from the corner of my eye. It was tall and thin, stretching unnaturally across the wall. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt like I was stuck in some sort of trance, my legs refusing to carry me away from it. The shadow grew larger, taller, and I swore I could feel something breathing on the back of my neck. A cold, wet breath that made my skin crawl. The air turned thick, suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, the footsteps started again, louder this time. They were no longer in the hallway. They were behind me. I spun around, and there, standing at the end of the hallway, was the figure of a man. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing. He was watching me, just standing there, motionless. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to escape, but I was paralyzed with fear. And then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The door, which had been locked just moments before, was now open. I didn't think, I just ran. I bolted out of the house, into the cold night air. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer, but when I turned around, no one was there. I stayed outside all night, not daring to go back inside. When dawn finally broke, I gathered up the courage to return. The house was still, silent, but the fear, that gnawing, relentless fear, hadn't left me, and neither had the shadow. Days passed, but the occurrences didn't stop. The footsteps, the shadow, they all returned, over and over again, like they were following me, never letting me escape. I started locking every door, checking every window, but it didn't matter. The house was never quiet. There was always something moving just out of sight. The worst part, I started seeing the shadow everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my eyes. Sometimes it felt like I wasn't even in control of my own body anymore, like something was taking over. One night, as I lay in bed, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't just in the house. They were outside. I heard them pacing around the perimeter, slow, methodical, like someone waiting for something. Or someone. I was too scared to look, too terrified to get up. But the door creaked open, and the shadow stepped into the room. This time, it wasn't alone. There were others, more shadows, crowding the doorway, their faces hidden in the darkness. I closed my eyes, hoping it was a nightmare, hoping it would all go away. But it didn't. When I opened them again, I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows were all around me, watching, waiting, and I realized, with a cold, sickening clarity, that whatever was in that house wasn't going to let me leave. It had been following me all along, and now it was ready to claim me. I was no longer sure what was real, and what was just a shadow. I had always found solace in the quiet. For years, I had dreamt of escaping the noise and chaos of the city, yearning for a place where the world seemed to slow down. That dream came true when I bought a small cabin nestled deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from the nearest neighbor. I'd been living there for almost 3 years now. It's a big place, with thick forest all around, and the lake just a short walk away. The air is crisp, the silence is heavy, and it feels like the rest of the world could vanish, and no one would notice. The cabin has everything I could ever need: a wood-burning stove, lit a large stone fireplace, and a view that stretches for miles across the dense forest. The nearest town is an hour away, so I rarely go there. The days pass by slowly and peacefully. Fishing is my escape. I'd sit by the lake for hours, the water lapping at the shore as I cast my line, letting my thoughts drift with the current. Most days, it feels like I'm the only one in the world. But about a month ago, something started happening. I didn't notice at first, but then the little things began to creep up on me. Sounds I couldn't explain, feelings I couldn't shake, a sense of being watched when I knew no one could be around. At first, I brushed it off. Living in isolation can play tricks on your mind. But as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It started with small things. Noises in the woods. A twig snapping. The rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was nothing out of the ordinary, I thought. The wildlife around here is abundant, and the forest is always alive with sound. Deer, squirrels, raccoons, maybe a fox or two, they all call the woods home. But the sounds, right? It wasn't just an animal moving through the trees. No, these noises felt deliberate, almost as if something was trying to get my attention. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods, the wind, the night playing tricks on me. But then, one evening, I was sitting on the porch, looking out into the blackness of the trees, when I heard a distinct, slow, scraping sound coming from the back of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to listen, but nothing else followed. I stood up, my feet heavy as I made my way toward the noise. The cabin felt different, heavier, colder. The wind had stopped. The forest was still. I walked around the back of the house, looking for any sign of what could have caused the sound. Nothing. I figured it must have been a branch dragging across the house, or maybe an animal, a raccoon or something. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered in my chest as I locked up for the night. The next night, it happened again. The scraping sound. Only now, it was louder, more deliberate, and this time, it came from the side of the house, just beneath the window of the spare bedroom. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't go out to investigate this time. Instead, I stayed inside, sitting by the fire, trying to push the strange sensation away. But I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, made me jump. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. But I couldn't bring myself to admit what I was starting to fear. The next few nights were the same. The scraping, then the tapping. It started to sound like someone was lightly rapping on the window, almost as if they were trying to get my attention. Each night, it got worse, more insistent. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to a soft, scratching sound, as if something was dragging its nails along the outside of the house. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was causing these noises, or I'd go insane. I grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar I'd kept in the shed, just in case, and went to the spare bedroom. The air inside the room was thick, musty. I hadn't opened the door to this room in weeks, and it smelled like old wood and dust. The flashlight beam flickered in the darkness, catching every shadow, making the room feel even colder. I swept the flashlight across the room, checking every corner, under the bed, behind the dresser. Nothing. There was nothing out of place. But as I was about to turn and leave, I noticed something odd. The closet door was cracked open. I don't remember leaving it that way. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the handle and pulled the door open, expecting to find maybe a forgotten item or an old box I'd left behind. But instead, there was nothing. Just empty space. I was about to turn away when I noticed something on the floor. A small, torn piece of fabric caught on the corner of the closet wall. It was dark, almost blackened. The edges were frayed as though it had been ripped. I froze. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an icy weight settle in my stomach. The fabric didn't belong to me. I didn't recognize it, and it didn't seem like something that would have come from the cabin. My mind raced. Had someone been in here? Had someone been watching me? My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. I backed away, my feet unsteady, my hands shaking. I slammed the closet door shut and locked it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't be alone in that cabin. I didn't care if it was just my imagination or if it was something worse. I ran outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But as I stood there on the porch, staring out into the woods, the darkness felt different. The trees, the shadows, they seemed to stretch toward me. It was like the woods were closing in. My mind was playing tricks, I told myself. This was all just fear, just the isolation getting to me. But then, I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the woods. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to be anywhere near that house anymore. But I had no choice. It was my home, and I wasn't about to let fear drive me away. I decided to sleep on the couch that night. I placed a baseball bat next to me for comfort, even though I knew deep down it wouldn't make any difference. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every noise seemed louder, sharper. I heard footsteps in the hall, faint at first, but growing closer. I held my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But there was nothing. Only the eerie silence that seemed to suffocate the house. The nights continued, each one more unsettling than the last. The tapping, the scratching, the whispers, they didn't stop. They followed me everywhere, seeping into my mind. I couldn't escape it. Every time I thought I could find peace, it would return. Sometimes, I'd hear a voice low, almost a whisper, coming from the walls. Sometimes, I'd find strange markings around the windows, as though something had been watching me for weeks, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I started to lose track of time. The days blurred together. The house felt like it was closing in on me. And then, one night, after weeks of torment, I found something that made my blood run cold. I had been sitting in the living room, staring out the window, when I noticed something move in the woods. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but as I focused, I realized it wasn't moving like any animal I had ever seen. It was tall, far too tall to be a person, and it moved slowly, deliberately. My heart stopped in my chest. I watched as it disappeared into the trees, and then, just like that, the woods were silent once more. But I knew that whatever it wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting. And it wasn't the only thing. If you've had a creepy home alone experience, be sure to share it with us in the comments below. And if you're looking for more stories like these, be sure to check out our other video on creepy encounters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content, and we'll catch you all in the next one.